biological contamination. I told him the truth. I said I was building a survival shelter. He asked what I was surviving. I said, whatever comes. My name is Elliot Adler. I was 41 years old the day Harwell visited, and I'd spent the previous 9 years of my life and $22 million of my software licensing fortune engineering what I believe to be the most comprehensive private survival infrastructure ever constructed on American soil. The shelter system, which I called Meridian, sat beneath 300 acres of privately owned land in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Western Virginia. Above ground, the property looked like a gentleman's farm. Rolling pasture, a restored colonial farmhouse, a barn with a standing seam metal roof. Below ground, it was something else entirely. Meridian had 5 sublevels. The first was logistics, water purification, geothermal power generation, air filtration rated to NATO CBRN standards. The second was agricultural, hydroponic bays capable of feeding 40 people indefinitely, seed vaults, protein cultivation chambers. The third was residential, with individual quarters, a medical bay, a small surgical suite, and a community kitchen. The fourth, the one I was finishing when Harwell arrived, was the armory and tactical operations level. The fifth, and this was the one that truly made the government nervous, was the communications hub, equipped with long-range radio arrays, satellite uplink capability, and an encrypted mesh network designed to function independently of every existing telecommunications grid on the planet. Harwell asked if I was building a compound. I said no. A compound implies hostility. Meridian was a lifeboat. He didn't seem to appreciate the distinction. That was 14 months before the Kessler virus emerged in the port city of Varna, Bulgaria, turning dock workers into something the initial WHO reports carefully described as subjects exhibiting extreme aggression and apparent insensitivity to pain. I watched those first shaky phone videos on a monitor in Sublevel 3, while my project manager, Dana Reeves, stood behind me chewing the end of a pen. Dana had been with me since the second year of construction. Former Army Corps of Engineers, built like a distance runner, with a precision about her that made every conversation feel like a briefing. She watched the footage of a man in a high-visibility vest sprinting into traffic on a Bulgarian highway, colliding with a sedan at full speed and rising from the asphalt without hesitation. She said, "That's not drugs." I said, "No." She said, "You're going to say you told me so." I didn't. Because the truth is, I never wanted to be right. Every bolt I'd tightened, every ton of concrete I'd poured, every sleepless night reviewing ventilation schematics, all of it had been powered by a hope that I was wasting my money, that I was the eccentric tech millionaire who'd built a palace underground for a disaster that would never arrive. I wanted to be a cautionary tale about paranoia, not a prophet. Dana pulled the pen from her mouth and looked at me with the expression she reserved for moments when the situation outpaced our planning. "How fast can we activate full lockdown protocol?" she asked. I checked my watch. 72 hours, if we start tonight. She nodded once, turned, and walked toward the communications console. We started that night. Meridian wasn't built for me alone. That was the part most people misunderstood, including Agent Harwell, including the journalists who eventually ran stories with headlines about doomsday bunkers and Silicon Valley survivalist cults. I designed the complex for a community. 40 people, carefully selected over 7 years, through a process I can only describe as the strangest job interview in modern history. I called them the Meridian 40. Dana called them the guest list. My therapist called them a coping mechanism. Each member was chosen for complementary skills. I had physicians, engineers, a veterinarian, a former wildfire incident commander, 2 teachers, a psychologist, a machinist, and a handful of generalists with the kind of calm temperament that stress tests well. Every person had agreed to a compact. In the event of a qualifying global emergency, they would report to Meridian within 48 hours, bringing only themselves, their immediate family, and whatever personal items fit into a single duffel bag. In exchange, they'd been given full access to train inside the facility twice a year, familiarizing themselves with its systems, its layout, its rules. The rules were extensive. I won't bore you with all of them, but the ones that mattered most were these. No weapons above sub-level 4 without authorization. No unauthorized communication with outside parties during lockdown. And all resource disputes mediated through a rotating council. I didn't want a dictatorship. I'd read enough history to know that bunkers run by one man's ego become tombs. By the time the Kessler virus footage surfaced, 31 of the Meridian 40 had confirmed their activation status. The remaining 9 were scattered across 3 continents, and I knew within the first 24 hours that some of them weren't going to make it. Marcus Cole was the first to arrive. He pulled up the gravel drive at 4 in the morning in a mud-splattered pickup truck with his 12-year-old daughter, Iris, asleep in the passenger seat. Marcus was a trauma surgeon from Charlottesville, compact and methodical, with hands so steady I'd once watched him suture a practice wound on a pork shoulder while carrying on a conversation about college football. He was also the only member of the group I considered a genuine friend. We'd met at a conference on disaster preparedness in Reston 6 years earlier, and I'd recruited him over a steak dinner where he told me, with no irony, that the thing that frightened him most wasn't death, but irrelevance. He wanted to be useful when the world needed him. He carried Iris inside while I briefed him in whispered fragments. Bulgaria, rapid spread, neurological degradation, extreme aggression in hosts. Transmission appeared to be fluid-borne. Incubation period unknown, possibly as short as 90 minutes. He absorbed all of it without changing expression, settled Iris into one of the residential quarters, and reported to the medical bay. By the next evening, 26 people had arrived at Meridian. Dana managed the intake process with military discipline. Biometric scans at the surface entrance, health screening in the decontamination corridor, assignment to quarters, orientation briefing in the common room. I stood at the back of that first briefing and looked at the faces of the people who had trusted me enough to uproot their lives on 48 hours' notice. Teachers and their children. A retired electrician named Gus Fremantle, who'd driven 11 hours from coastal Georgia with his wife, Pearl, and a cooler full of homemade peach preserves because he said no civilization was worth saving without decent food. I wanted to tell them something reassuring. Something presidential. What I said instead was, the systems work. I've tested them. We have food, water, power, medical capability, and security. What we don't have is certainty about what's happening on the surface. So we're going to seal the doors, we're going to monitor, and we're going to take care of each other. Pearl Fremantle nodded from the third row like I'd said something she already knew. Gus patted her knee. That night, Dana and I sealed the primary blast door. 14 inches of steel and composite, rated to withstand a direct hit from a bunker buster munition. The hydraulics hummed, the locks engaged, and the sound of the Virginia night vanished like someone had pressed mute on the world. We were inside. Whatever was coming was outside. For now. The government's interest in Meridian didn't end with Agent Harwell's visit. 6 months before the outbreak, I received a formal letter from the Department of Defense, Office of the Undersecretary for Policy, informing me that my facility had been classified under Executive Provision 7114 as a non-state critical infrastructure concern. The language was dense and bureaucratic, but Dana translated it for me in her usual fashion. They were saying that a private citizen had no business building something this capable, and they wanted the option to seize it if they deemed it necessary. I hired 3 attorneys. 2 of them specialized in federal property law. The third specialized in making problems go away before they reached a courtroom. Between them, they burned through $400,000 in billable hours constructing a legal fortress around Meridian that mirrored the physical one. We challenged the classification. We filed injunctions. We argued that Executive Provision 7114 was designed for foreign-owned telecom infrastructure, not a private residence in the mountains of Virginia. We won, technically. The classification was suspended pending review, which in Washington meant it would sit in a filing cabinet until someone remembered it existed. But the damage was reputational. The story leaked. A reporter from the Washington Post called me a techno-survivalist with a messiah complex. A cable news anchor asked, on air, whether I was building an underground nation. My ex-wife, Claire, who I hadn't spoken to in 4 years, texted me a single line. I hope whatever you're hiding from is worth it. I wasn't hiding. I was preparing. But the distinction felt increasingly thin, even to me. When the Kessler virus hit the continental United States, it moved through the eastern seaboard like a lit fuse through a powder trail. The initial vector was a container ship that docked in Norfolk, Virginia, less than 200 miles from Meridian. Port workers were the first affected, then EMTs, then the staff of 3 hospitals that received patients before anyone understood what fluid-borne transmission meant in a medical setting. Within 72 hours, Norfolk was under federal quarantine. Within 96, the quarantine had failed. I watched the feeds from Sublevel 5 with Dana, Marcus, and a woman named Priya Chandrasekaran, our communications specialist. Priya had worked for FEMA's emergency alert system before I recruited her. She had access to frequencies most civilians didn't know existed, and what she was pulling from those frequencies painted a picture far worse than anything the news was reporting. Military units redeploying to defensive cordons around Washington. FEMA requesting authorization for mass casualty protocols. CDC internal traffic using the word irreversible with alarming frequency. Priya muted the scanner and looked at me. She was a small woman with sharp features and an economy of movement that suggested she'd spent years working in spaces where panic was a luxury no one could afford. She said, "They're not going to contain this. Norfolk was the test case, and they failed it." Marcus asked how long before the infection spread west into the mountains. Priya pulled up a topographic overlay on the monitor and traced possible routes. Highways first, then secondary roads as refugees fled the urban zones. She estimated we had between 5 and 8 days before infected individuals reached our region. But she cautioned that the estimate assumed rational movement patterns, and nothing about the Kessler virus suggested rationality. That night, I activated the perimeter defense grid. Meridian surface property was ringed with passive deterrents, motion-activated floodlights, acoustic sensors, and a network of cameras feeding real-time imagery to monitors in the Tactical Operations Center on Sublevel 4. I'd resisted installing anything lethal. Dana had argued for it. I'd overruled her, saying I didn't want to build a killing field. Now, standing in the tactical center watching green-tinted camera feeds of empty pasture and dark tree lines, I wondered if restraint was a form of arrogance. Dana appeared beside me with 2 mugs of coffee. She handed me one without ceremony. You're staring at grass, she said. I'm waiting. Waiting doesn't change what's coming. She sipped her coffee. We need to talk about the Western Access Road. It's not gated. She was right. I'd left it open for late arrivals. 5 members of the Meridian 40 still hadn't reported in. One more day, I said. Dana held my gaze for a long moment, then nodded. One more day. The Western Access Road brought 3 more people by dawn. Felix Okafor, a structural engineer from Richmond, arrived alone in a sedan with a shattered rear window. He said he'd driven through a checkpoint outside Lynchburg, where National Guard soldiers were firing into a crowd that was no longer entirely human. He described the sound. Not screaming, not shouting, but a wet, guttural chorus that didn't correspond to any vocalization he'd ever associated with a living person. He sat in the decontamination corridor with his hands on his knees and his eyes fixed on the floor tiles. And I noticed he'd bitten through his lower lip sometime during the drive. 2 hours later, Nadia Visser and her teenage son, Theo, arrived on foot. Nadia was our agricultural specialist, a former botanist from the University of Virginia with a deep, practical knowledge of food systems that went beyond hydroponics into soil ecology, seed genetics, and caloric yield optimization. She'd abandoned her car 12 miles east when the highway became impassable, not from infected, but from other survivors. Thousands of people fleeing west in vehicles that had run out of fuel, creating a metallic glacier across both lanes that nothing could penetrate. She and Theo had walked through the mountains for 9 hours. Theo's shoes were held together with duct tape. Nadia's face had the blank composure of someone who had decided to process everything later. I brought them water and food and watched Nadia catalog the hydroponic bays with the same meticulous attention she'd shown during training exercises, as though the world above hadn't fractured. It was denial, perhaps, or maybe it was something more functional. The ability to locate a task that mattered and pour yourself into it so completely that the horror couldn't find a foothold. I envied her that. With Felix, Nadia, and Theo, our count reached 29. 11 members of the Meridian 40 were unaccounted for. 2, a married couple from Boston named the Weissmans, had sent a final message through the encrypted channels saying they couldn't get past the military cordon around New York and were turning back. I never heard from them again. On the 3rd day inside, I made the decision to seal the Western Access Road. It was the hardest choice I'd made since beginning Meridian. And I made it at 4 in the morning in the Tactical Operations Center, with Dana at my side and the weight of 11 absent names pressing against my sternum. The cameras showed the first infected in our region. A figure moving along the tree line at the northern boundary, lurching with a broken gait that suggested catastrophic neurological damage, but maintaining a forward momentum that was deeply, fundamentally wrong. It paused near the fence, and the motion-activated floodlights snapped on, bathing it in white light. It had been a woman once, middle-aged, wearing a torn fleece jacket. Her jaw was dislocated, hanging open at an angle that would have been agonizing for someone who could still feel pain. She looked directly at the camera, and I understood in that moment that whatever the Kessler virus did to the brain, it didn't eliminate awareness entirely. Something was looking at me through those eyes. Something that recognized the light and the fence and the camera for what they were. Barriers between it and what it wanted. Dana reached across me and activated the gate controls. The Western Road barrier descended. Hydraulic bollards rising from the asphalt, reinforced cables strung between steel posts. The others will have to use the emergency tunnel entrance, she said. If they come. I didn't argue. The woman on the camera feed had turned away from the light and moved back into the trees with an efficiency that contradicted her damaged body. She wasn't wandering. She was patrolling. I closed my eyes and recited the names of the 11 who hadn't arrived. David and Rachel Weissman, Tom Pruitt, Sophia Mendez, James Cartwright, Angela Yee, Raymond and Lila Singh, Peter Olson, Catherine Tate, Yusuf Baraka. I'd chosen each of them. I'd promised each of them a place. I went to my quarters, sat on the edge of the bed I'd designed and paid for and installed, and I sat with the reality that a promise and a sealed door are incompatible things. The first week underground recalibrated everyone's relationship with time. Without natural light, without weather, without the ambient rhythms of a world operating on its own schedule, the hours inside Meridian became elastic. I'd installed full-spectrum lighting on timers to simulate a day-night cycle. But the simulation fooled the eyes without convincing the body. People drifted. Meals were eaten at irregular intervals. Conversations started and stopped without resolution, suspended in a temporal fog that made everything feel both urgent and interminable. Marcus established a medical routine, daily health checks, blood pressure monitoring, a symptom log that every resident was required to complete each morning. It gave structure to the formless days. Nadia had the hydroponic bays operational within 48 hours. And the sight of green shoots pushing through growing medium under artificial light became a small, irrational beacon of normalcy. Gus Fremantle appointed himself head of the kitchen and organized a meal schedule that he enforced with a gentle stubbornness no one had the energy to resist. Pearl assisted him and somehow conjured comfort food from shelf-stable ingredients. Biscuits with reconstituted gravy. A bean soup she claimed was her grandmother's recipe adapted for the apocalypse. But the surface feeds told a different story from the one we were living inside. Priya monitored communications around the clock, rotating with 2 other residents she'd trained on the equipment. The picture that emerged was comprehensive and devastating. Norfolk had fallen entirely. Richmond was contested, with military units fighting block by block in a city whose civilian population had either fled or turned. Washington, D.C. was under martial law. The government operating from continuity of operations facilities whose locations were classified, but whose radio signatures Priya could triangulate with disturbing precision. The infection's behavior was evolving. Early reports had described the Kessler afflicted as mindlessly aggressive, charging towards sound, attacking anything that moved, burning out physically within days. But the footage and intercepts from the second week told a different story. Infected individuals were congregating, not randomly, not in the aimless herds that early models had predicted, but in coordinated groups that moved with apparent purpose. Military analysts on intercepted channels were using words like swarm intelligence and emergent coordination, and I could hear the controlled terror behind their professional diction. On the 9th day, a group of 7 infected appeared at Meridian's northern perimeter. The cameras captured them emerging from the tree line in a loose formation, spacing themselves at irregular intervals like soldiers trained in dispersal tactics. They approached the fence, tested it at multiple points simultaneously, and withdrew when the acoustic deterrence activated. The entire encounter lasted 11 minutes. It felt like a reconnaissance mission. I played the footage for Dana, Marcus, and Felix in the tactical center. Felix, who had been largely silent since his arrival, spoke first. He said the spacing was too deliberate to be coincidental. He said the simultaneous probing of multiple fence points suggested distributed problem solving. He said we needed to assume they were learning. Dana asked what they were learning. Felix said they were learning the boundaries. That evening, I convened the first full community meeting in the common room on sublevel 3. 29 people sat in chairs arranged in concentric semicircles, and I stood before them feeling nothing like the leader they needed and everything like the man who had simply signed the checks. I showed them the perimeter footage. I explained what Felix had observed. I laid out the tactical situation without embellishment. A teacher named Laura Chen asked if the fence would hold. I said yes, for now. She asked what happened when, for now, expired. I didn't have an answer that would satisfy her, so I gave her an honest one. I said we would adapt. That the entire philosophy of Meridian was adaptation, not permanence. That the shelter wasn't a destination, but a platform from which to respond to whatever came next. Laura looked at me with the patient skepticism of someone who had spent 20 years managing the expectations of children and could spot an adult doing the same thing. That's a lovely concept, she said. But those things outside aren't a philosophy exam. Several people laughed. It was nervous laughter, but it was real. And it broke something loose in the room, they say. I laughed too. She was right. On the 12th day, the government came back. Not Agent Harwell this time. He was almost certainly dead or displaced. But a voice on Priya's encrypted military channel, broadcasting on a frequency that should have been impossible to access without Meridian-grade equipment. The voice identified itself as Colonel Miriam Sharp, United States Army, attached to something called Joint Task Force Reconstitution. She addressed me by name. She knew the facility designation. She knew the number of residents inside. She asked to negotiate. Dana was against it. She stood with her arms crossed in the communications hub on sublevel 5 and argued that any contact with military command was a precursor to seizure. She reminded me of Executive Provision 7114, the classification that had labeled Meridian a threat to national security. She said Sharp's outreach wasn't a negotiation. It was targeting. Priya disagreed. She said Sharp's transmission signature indicated she was broadcasting from a mobile command post, not a fixed installation. That suggested she was in the field, not behind a desk. Field officers negotiate because they need something. Priya wanted to know what Sharp needed. Marcus sided with Priya. He said isolation was sustainable for months, maybe years, but that eventually we'd need to understand the larger picture. Whether organized resistance existed, whether a vaccine was in development, whether the infection had a ceiling. He said cutting ourselves off from every external voice was survivable but not intelligent. I listened to each of them. I'd built Meridian with a council structure specifically to avoid autocratic decision-making. And I tried to honor that structure even when the arguments pointed in different directions. But the final call on external communications rested with me, not because I'd given myself that authority, but because Priya's encryption protocols were keyed to my biometric signature. A safety measure I'd implemented during construction that now felt less like prudence and more like an unfair concentration of power. I authorized the channel. Priya opened a two-way encrypted link, and Colonel Sharp's voice filled the communications hub, clipped, professional, and carrying the undertone of someone who hadn't slept in a week. She said the situation was worse than any public broadcast had indicated. East Coast infrastructure had collapsed almost entirely. The federal government was operating from fragmented nodes with intermittent communication. The Kessler virus had reached the Midwest, and international reports suggested it had spread to every inhabited continent. She said the military had lost 60% of its active duty personnel to infection, desertion, or death. She said the word containment was no longer part of their operational vocabulary. Then she got to the point. Joint Task Force Reconstitution was a continuity of species initiative. They were identifying surviving civilian populations with resources and defensible positions and integrating them into a network of hardened sites that could sustain human life through what she called the bottleneck period. She wanted Meridian in that network. She wanted our communications hub as a relay node. She wanted our medical bay as a triage point. She wanted, in effect, to absorb us. In exchange, she offered military protection, supply supplementation, and access to intelligence about infection patterns and potential countermeasures. She said a research team in Colorado had identified a promising avenue for a neurological inhibitor that might slow the virus's progression. She couldn't share details over the channel, but she could have a liaison officer at our perimeter within 72 hours. I asked what happened to facilities that declined integration. Sharp paused for exactly 2 seconds. Then she said, "Mr. Adler, this isn't a threat. We don't have the resources for threats. I'm offering a partnership because your facility is better than anything we've built, and we're running out of time." Dana leaned close to my ear and whispered, "She just told you they know exactly how good our facility is. Ask yourself how." I asked Sharp for 24 hours to consult with my community. She agreed. The channel closed. The room was silent. Priya began running a trace on Sharp's transmission origin. Marcus rubbed his temples. Dana stared at the dead speaker like it might reactivate with additional demands. I had 24 hours to decide whether the door I'd built to keep the world out should be open to let the government in. The community meeting that followed was the most contentious hour I've experienced inside Meridian, and I include in that comparison the night we sealed the doors. 29 people sat in the common room and argued about trust, sovereignty, survival, and the meaning of the shelter they were sitting inside. Gus Fremantle spoke first, as he often did, with the directness of a man who had spent 40 years as an electrician and had no patience for abstraction. He said the military had failed to contain the virus, failed to protect its own personnel, and was now asking to move into the one place that had done both. He said that sounded less like partnership and more like a man with no house asking for the keys to yours. Pearl sat beside him and nodded with each sentence like she was keeping time. Laura Chen took the opposite position. She said isolation without information was a slow death of a different kind. She said her students, she'd brought 3 of them to Meridian, teenagers whose parents were among the unaccounted, needed to believe the world still existed beyond the blast door. She said hope without external contact was just delusion with better lighting. Felix, who had barely spoken in 12 days, stood and delivered a precise structural analysis of the risk. If a military liaison entered Meridian, they would map the facility's layout, assess its capabilities, and transmit that information up a chain of command that might eventually decide the facility was more useful under government control than civilian stewardship. He said the legal protections we'd established before the outbreak were meaningless now. Executive Provision 7114, the injunctions, the property rights, all of it was paper, and paper didn't survive the collapse of the courts that enforced it. Nadia asked a question no one else had raised. What did integration mean for our autonomy over food production? If the military sent personnel, those personnel would need to eat. Our hydroponic systems were calibrated for 29 people with a moderate surplus. Every additional body reduced the margin. She'd run the numbers. 10 additional residents would cut our food buffer from 8 months to 3. 20 would eliminate it entirely. The room split roughly in thirds. A faction wanted to refuse Sharp outright. A faction wanted to accept with conditions. A third faction, smaller, quieter, wanted more information before committing. Marcus led the third group, arguing for a limited engagement. Accept the liaison officer, hear the intelligence, evaluate the terms, and reserve the right to withdraw. He compared it to a medical consultation. You don't commit to surgery before the diagnosis. I listened to every voice. I tracked the emotional currents beneath the arguments. The fear of losing what we'd built, the fear of being alone, the fear that the decision itself was a trap with no safe exit. When the room finally exhausted itself, I stood and proposed Marcus's framework. Limited engagement, one liaison, 72-hour evaluation period, full community vote before any further integration. The vote was 19 in favor, 7 against, 3 abstaining. Dana was among the 7. She voted no with her eyes locked on mine, and I understood her opposition wasn't just tactical. It was personal. She'd built this place with me, beam by beam, conduit by conduit. It was as much hers as mine, and I was proposing to hand a stranger the combination. After the meeting, she found me in the corridor outside the armory. The lighting on sub-level 4 was deliberately cooler than the residential level, a design choice meant to maintain alertness in the tactical spaces. It made her face look carved from stone. "You're making a mistake," she said. "Maybe." "Not maybe, definitely. You're letting sentiment override security." It was a democratic vote, Dana. Democracy is a luxury. We can afford it when the threat is theoretical. Right now, the threat is standing at the fence testing our perimeter, and you want to invite its competition inside. She walked away before I could respond. Her boots echoed on the concrete like a metronome, counting down to something I couldn't yet see. I returned to sub-level 5 and opened the channel. I told Colonel Sharp we'd accept her liaison. She said the officer would arrive in 48 hours. 48 hours. The countdown began. His name was Lieutenant Adrian Voss, and he arrived at the emergency tunnel entrance at 0600 on a Tuesday that felt no different from any other day underground. He came alone, on foot, carrying a military rucksack and a sidearm he surrendered without protest when Dana demanded it at the decontamination threshold. He submitted to the health screening, the biometric scan, and a pat-down so thorough it bordered on hostile. He endured all of it with a calm that struck me as either profoundly disciplined or deeply rehearsed. Voss was younger than I expected. Early 30s, lean, with close-cropped hair and a thin scar bisecting his left eyebrow that he never explained and I never asked about. He spoke with the measured cadence of someone trained in briefings, but his eyes moved constantly, cataloging the corridor dimensions, the lighting fixtures, the ventilation grate placements. Dana noticed. She always noticed. I gave him a tour of the common areas only, sub-level 3 residential, the kitchen, the medical bay. I deliberately excluded the tactical level, the armory, and the communications hub. He didn't ask to see them, which worried me more than if he had. A man who doesn't ask about the things he most wants to know is a man who expects to learn about them another way. Over a meal in the common room, Voss briefed us on the surface situation with a clinical thoroughness that silenced the table. He confirmed what Priya's intercepts had suggested. Organized governance had fragmented into regional nodes with unreliable communication. The eastern seaboard was largely abandoned by military forces, which had consolidated into defensive positions around inland agricultural zones and critical infrastructure. The infection had not plateaued. The Kessler virus continued to spread, and the behavioral evolution of the infected was accelerating. Coordinated swarm attacks on fortified positions had been documented in at least 14 states. He showed us photographs on a hardened tablet, images of overrun military checkpoints, breached walls, the aftermath of engagements where the defenders had been overwhelmed not by numbers, but by strategy. Iris Cole, Marcus's daughter, was sitting 2 tables away doing schoolwork that Laura Chen had assigned. She glanced at the tablet screen. Marcus moved to block her view, but she'd already seen. She looked at her father with an expression that contained no shock, no tears. Just a quiet recalculation of the world she was going to grow up in. It was the most disturbing thing I witnessed that day, and I'd been looking at images of destroyed military bases. After the meal, Voss and I spoke privately in a small conference room on sub-level 3. He dropped the briefing voice and spoke more directly. He said Sharp's offer was genuine, but incomplete. The Joint Task Force needed Meridian not just as a relay node, but as a regional command hub. The facility's communications capabilities exceeded anything the military had operational in the Mid-Atlantic region. If Meridian agreed to full integration, Sharp intended to relocate her mobile command post here within 30 days and use the shelter as a base of operations for coordinating survivor networks across 4 states. I asked what that meant for the civilians already living here. Voss said they would be incorporated into the operational framework. I asked him to translate. He said some residents would be assigned roles supporting military operations. Others, those without useful skills, would be relocated to a civilian camp the task force was establishing near a decommissioned coal mine in West Virginia. Relocated. The word landed between us with the weight of everything it implied. The people I'd invited, the community I'd built, the promise I'd made, all of it subordinated to an operational framework that viewed my neighbors as assets to be sorted and distributed. I asked Voss if he personally agreed with his plan. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What I agree with doesn't factor into my orders, Mr. Adler." I said, "It factors into mine." He studied me. Something shifted behind his eyes, not quite respect, but a recognition that the conversation had crossed from negotiation into something more fundamental. "You have 72 hours, he said. "After that, Colonel Sharp will request a direct answer. And if the answer is no?" He didn't respond. He didn't have to. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat in the dim corridor outside the hydroponic bays on sub-level 2 and listened to the hum of the grow lights through the sealed door. A sound like a mechanical heartbeat, steady and indifferent to the decisions being made around it. The plants didn't care about Colonel Sharp or Lieutenant Voss or Executive Provision 7114. They cared about light and water and nutrient solution. There was something painfully instructive in that simplicity, that Dana found me there. She seemed to have a talent for locating me during my lowest moments, as though the facility's sensor grid reported my emotional state, along with temperature and humidity. She sat beside me on the corridor floor without invitation and extended her legs in front of her, boots crossed at the ankles. "I listened to the briefing through the door," she said. "Conference room acoustics are terrible. I should have specified better insulation during construction." I didn't bother asking if she'd eavesdropped deliberately. The answer was obvious. "They want to take it," I said. "Of course they do. That's what governments do when they can't build something. They requisition it. They did it with factories in World War II. They did it with private land for interstate highways. They'll do it with Meridian and call it patriotic necessity." Voss said some residents would be relocated. Voss said what he was told to say. The reality will be worse. The people they relocate will end up in a camp with no infrastructure, no medical support, and no security perimeter. They'll be displaced to make room for soldiers and equipment. That's not integration. That's occupation. She was articulating the fear I'd been circling for hours. Meridian was designed for care, not command. Its architecture expressed a philosophy that survival without dignity was just a slower form of death. The moment it became a military installation, that philosophy would be overwritten by operational priorities that valued efficiency over humanity. But Dana's certainty also troubled me. She had been against external contact from the beginning, and her arguments, while sound, carried an undertone of something closer to possessiveness than principle. Meridian was her achievement as much as mine. She'd overseen every structural element, every system installation, every redundancy protocol. The idea of military engineers walking her corridors, auditing her work, potentially modifying her designs, I suspected that offended her on a level she wouldn't articulate. I told her what I was thinking, directly, without diplomatic cushioning. She deserved that. She was quiet for a long time. The grow lights hummed. Somewhere on the level above, Gus's voice carried faintly as he narrated something to Pearl. A story, a memory. The kind of ambient domestic warmth that made the shelter feel inhabited rather than merely occupied. "You're not wrong," Dana said finally. "I built this place. I don't want to hand it over. But that's not why I'm arguing against Sharp. I'm arguing against her because I've seen military command absorb civilian infrastructure before. I was in the Army Corps when they took over a municipal water system in Flint. It was supposed to be temporary. It was supposed to be helpful. It became neither." She looked at me. In the low light, the angles of her face softened. "You built something extraordinary, Elliot. You built it because you believed ordinary people could sustain themselves without permission from a chain of command. If you let Sharp in, you're conceding that belief," I said. "And if I keep her out, and the infected breach the perimeter, and people die because we didn't have the military resources that could have saved them." She didn't answer. It was the first time I'd posed a question she couldn't address with logistics or precedent. It was a question about faith. Whether I had more faith in the community I'd built or the institution that wanted to subsume it. I sat in that corridor until the simulated dawn cycle brightened the lights overhead. And I carried the question with me into the morning, like a stone I couldn't put down. 72 hours became 48. Then 24. The answer couldn't wait any longer. I told Sharp no. I did it from the communications hub with Dana, Marcus, Priya, and Voss present. I said Meridian would remain an independent civilian facility. I said we were willing to share intelligence, relay communications, and coordinate on matters of mutual benefit. But we would not accept military command authority, personnel integration, or resident relocation. I said it was a final decision, reached by community vote, and I respected her mission, but couldn't subordinate my people to it. Sharp was silent for 8 seconds. I counted. Then she said, "Mr. Adler, I understand your position, and I won't pretend I'm not disappointed. But I want to be transparent. My mandate includes securing critical infrastructure nodes in this region. Your facility is the most capable node I've identified. If you won't integrate voluntarily, the calculus changes." Dana leaned toward the microphone. "Colonel, the calculus hasn't changed. You don't have the resources to take this facility. You said so yourself." Sharp's tone cooled perceptibly. "Ms. Reeves, resource limitations are temporary. Decisions are permanent. I'd encourage Mr. Adler to consider the long-term implications." The channel closed. Voss, who had been standing against the far wall with his hands clasped behind his back, exhaled slowly. He looked at me without the professional mask for the first time. "You just made an enemy of someone who doesn't forget," he said. I asked if he intended to leave. He said his orders were to remain as liaison regardless of the integration decision. I said he was welcome to stay, but would be subject to the same rules as every other resident. He nodded. Then he asked if he could have his sidearm back. Dana said no. He accepted that too, with a resignation that suggested he'd expected the answer. 3 days later, the perimeter was tested in a way that changed everything. At 03:14, the acoustic sensors on the eastern boundary activated simultaneously along a 400-meter stretch. Priya routed the camera feeds to the tactical center, and what we saw wasn't a patrol or a probing group. It was a coordinated assault. Approximately 60 infected individuals emerged from the tree line in a formation that covered the full width of the eastern fence, spaced at intervals that prevented the acoustic deterrents from creating a unified barrier of sound. They'd learned. Felix had predicted it, and the prediction had arrived with horrifying precision. The fence held for 11 minutes. The infected didn't climb it. They pushed. Bodies pressed against the chain link with a collective force that exceeded every load calculation we'd run during construction. The posts bent. The concrete footings cracked. I watched on the monitor as 60 bodies compressed against the barrier with the singular mechanical focus of a hydraulic press made of flesh. When the fence failed, they poured through the gap like water through a broken dam. Dana activated the secondary deterrents, strobing lights, high-decibel sirens, the full suite of non-lethal countermeasures I'd insisted upon. The infected scattered momentarily, then regrouped. The strobes seemed to disorient them for approximately 40 seconds. After that, they adapted and continued toward the surface structures. Marcus was already in the medical bay, preparing for casualties we didn't yet have. Nadia sealed the hydroponic bays. Gus gathered the children, Iris, Theo, Laura's 3 students, and moved them to the deepest residential quarters. Pearl went with them, her peach preserves forgotten, her hands steady on Iris's shoulders. I stood in the tactical center and made the decision I'd resisted for 9 years. I told Dana to open the armory. She didn't say, "I told you so." She didn't even look at me with vindication. She simply entered her authorization code, and the sub-level 4 armory unlocked with a pneumatic hiss that sounded like the facility itself was exhaling. Voss appeared at my shoulder. Without his sidearm, without a uniform, he looked like any other frightened person in a concrete corridor. But his voice was steady when he spoke. "I have tactical training. Let me help." I handed him a weapon. Dana handed him a tactical vest. We moved toward the surface access corridor as a group. Voss, Dana, Felix, and myself. 4 people ascending toward a sound that had already seeped through 3 feet of reinforced concrete. The sound of something that used to be human, but wasn't anymore. Not entirely. The surface level of Meridian was designed as a buffer zone, a transitional space between the underground facility and the open air, architecturally hardened, but not intended as a permanent defensive position. The farmhouse above was cosmetic, a shell built over a reinforced core that housed the primary surface access point, a vault-grade door at the base of a concealed stairwell. The infected hadn't reached it yet. They were still in the pasture, moving toward the barn, drawn by the residual heat signature of the geothermal venting system I'd routed through the outbuilding as camouflage. Dana directed us to observation positions at reinforced windows on the farmhouse's ground floor. The windows were ballistic-rated polycarbonate behind decorative shutters, another dual-purpose design element that now justified its cost 1,000-fold. Through the glass, I watched the infected cross the pasture in the blue-white wash of the emergency floodlights. They moved with a fluidity that contradicted their damaged bodies, some running, others walking with a deliberate gait that suggested conservation of energy. They were not mindless. They were economical. Voss assessed the field with the rapid parsing of a man reading terrain the way most people read a page. He identified the primary concentration moving toward the barn, a secondary group flanking toward the western tree line, and a smaller cluster, perhaps 8 individuals, that had separated from the main body and was approaching the farmhouse directly. Those 8 concerned him most. He said their deviation from the group suggested either independent initiative or an assigned objective, and neither possibility was comforting. We engaged the 8 from the ground floor windows. I will not describe it in detail, because the act of firing a weapon at a figure that still wears a human face is not something that benefits from a narration. I will say that Dana's accuracy was surgical, that Voss operated with the mechanical proficiency his training demanded, that Felix's hands shook but his shots were effective, and that I missed more than I hit because my vision was blurred by something I initially attributed to adrenaline and later recognized as grief. The 8 fell. Some took multiple rounds before their bodies conceded to physics. One, a young man in a college sweatshirt, crawled toward the farmhouse door after his legs failed, pulling himself across the gravel with his arms, his jaw working soundlessly. Dana ended his progress with a single shot. She turned away afterward and pressed her forehead against the window frame for 3 seconds. Then she straightened and resumed her position. The barn contingent was a larger problem. Approximately 40 infected had reached the outbuilding and were tearing at its structure with a focused industriousness that reduced the metal roof panels to ribbons of aluminum within minutes. They were searching for the heat source, following the geothermal vent signature into the ground, pulling at the concrete pad that covered the vent shaft. If they breached the vent, they'd have a direct conduit into sublevel 1. I radioed Priya. She confirmed the vent shaft was sealed with a secondary gate at the sublevel junction, a precaution I'd installed during construction and subsequently forgotten about. The gate was rated for significant force, but had never been tested against sustained biological assault. She said she'd monitor the pressure sensors and alert us if the gate showed signs of compromise. Voss suggested we draw the barn group away from the vent. He proposed using the acoustic system to create a directional sound signature at the northern fence gap, the same breach they'd entered through, essentially ringing a dinner bell on the far side of the property. Dana reconfigured the system from the tactical center remotely, routing a low-frequency pulse through the northern speakers. It worked. The infected at the barn paused, oriented toward the new sound, and began moving north in a loose column. They abandoned the vent shaft with the same unsettling coordination they'd used to breach the fence, transitioning from one objective to another without confusion or delay. Within 20 minutes, the property was clear. The infected had exited through the northern breach and disappeared into the forest. The floodlights illuminated empty pasture, torn fencing, and the mangled remains of a barn that would never shelter anything again. Dana's voice came over the radio, flat with exhaustion. "They'll come back. They know we're here now." She was right. They would. The aftermath of the breach changed the internal dynamics of Meridian more profoundly than any external threat could have. We'd been tested, and we'd survived. But the survival had cost us something that couldn't be replenished from stores. I saw it in the way people moved through the corridors in the days that followed. A contracted quality, a drawing inward, as though the walls of the shelter had shrunk by some imperceptible measure. Felix threw himself into fortification planning with a fervor that bordered on obsession. He redesigned the perimeter defense in 3 days, proposing a secondary fence line backed by earthworks and channeling structures that would funnel any future assault into kill zones. The term kill zone entered our vocabulary without ceremony, and its arrival marked the death of something I'd tried to preserve: the idea that Meridian could exist without violence. Marcus treated the minor injuries from the engagement. Cuts from broken glass, a sprained wrist Felix had sustained recoiling from his weapon, a burn on Donna's forearm from a hot barrel she'd grabbed without thinking. But the wounds he couldn't treat were the ones I was most concerned about. Iris hadn't spoken since the night of the breach. She sat in the medical bay while her father worked and drew on a tablet with a stylus, and every drawing was the same. A house surrounded by a high wall, and beyond the wall, shapes that weren't quite people. Marcus showed me the drawings when Iris wasn't looking, and his hands, those famously steady hands, trembled. Theo Visser, Nadia's son, responded differently. He asked Voss to teach him to handle a weapon. Nadia refused. Theo argued loudly in the corridor outside the residential quarters that everyone who could contribute to defense should be allowed to. He was 15. His voice cracked with the hormonal instability of adolescence, layered over the acute stress of survival. And the combination produced an anger that filled the corridor like smoke. Nadia pulled him into their quarters and closed the door. And I heard the muffled sound of a conversation that was part discipline, part pleading, and entirely heartbreaking. Gus and Pearl became the facility's emotional infrastructure in ways I hadn't anticipated. Gus repaired things, not just mechanical systems, but the small domestic damages that accumulated in close quarters. A squeaking door hinge, a flickering light, a shelf that had come loose during the seismic vibration of the breach. Each repair was minor. Collectively, they were a statement that order persisted, that someone cared about the details, that the world inside was still worth maintaining. Pearl organized a communal dinner 3 nights after the breach and served a meal that used the last of her peach preserves on biscuits she'd baked from scratch. She didn't make a speech. She didn't need to. The act of eating together, of tasting something sweet in a world that had turned bitter, carried its own eloquence. I convened the council, the rotating mediation body I'd established in the original compact, and proposed what I called the Meridian Doctrine. It had 3 components. First, the shelter would remain independent, but would establish communication channels with any verified civilian survivor group within radio range. Second, we would develop the capacity to project force at the perimeter, but would never pursue offensive action against the infected beyond our boundaries. Third, we would accept new residents up to our agricultural carrying capacity, provided they submitted to the same screening and compact requirements as original members. The doctrine was my answer to Sharp, to the infected, and to the creeping nihilism I could feel infiltrating the corridors. It was a declaration that Meridian wasn't a bunker, it was a community, and a community had obligations that extended beyond its own survival. The vote was unanimous in favor. Even Dana, who had opposed every external engagement since the doors sealed, voted yes. When I asked her why, she said, "Because a fortress without a purpose is just a tomb with better ventilation." It was the closest thing to poetry Dana had ever produced, and I took it as a sign that something fundamental had shifted in the way we understood ourselves and the shelter that contained us. The Meridian Doctrine's first test came 17 days after the breach, in a form none of us had anticipated. Priya intercepted a civilian distress signal originating from approximately 12 miles southeast. A group of survivors holed up in a rural elementary school, running low on water and surrounded by infected that had established a persistent presence in the surrounding streets. The voice on the radio belonged to a woman named Joanna Merritt, a county emergency dispatcher who had gathered 31 people during the initial collapse and led them to the only structure she knew with a reinforced basement and an independent water supply. 31 people. the same number we had inside Meridian. The symmetry was uncomfortable. Joanna's group included 14 children under 12, 8 elderly adults, and 9 people of working age, 3 of whom had sustained injuries during their retreat to the school. Their water supply had failed 2 days earlier when the building's well pump burned out. They were drinking from a rooftop rainwater collection system Joanna had improvised from tarps and guttering, but April had been dry, and the collection was insufficient. She estimated they had 48 hours before dehydration became critical for the youngest and oldest members. I assembled the council. The debate was swift but intense. We couldn't accommodate 31 additional people without catastrophically exceeding our food production capacity. Nadia confirmed the numbers. 31 new residents would push us past the hydroponic system's maximum output within 6 weeks, even with rationing. We would be saving them today and starving alongside them in 2 months. Marcus proposed a middle path. We couldn't bring them here, but we could go to them. A small team could transport water purification equipment and enough supplies to sustain them for 30 days while we worked to establish a secondary site. Perhaps the school itself, reinforced and supplied from Meridian's reserves. It was a massive resource expenditure with no guarantee of success. But it was consistent with the doctrine we'd just adopted. Voss volunteered immediately. He said the 12-mile distance was manageable for a vehicle convoy if we mapped the route using Priya's drone, a small surveillance UAV I'd purchased for perimeter monitoring that could provide real-time overhead imagery. Dana would lead the tactical element. Felix would assess the school's structural integrity for potential fortification. Marcus would provide medical support. I wanted to go. Dana told me I couldn't. She was right, and we both knew why without it needing to be spoken. If the mission failed, Meridian needed its architect. The logic was sound, and the conclusion was miserable. I was the man who signed the checks and designed the systems, but would stay safe underground while others risked their lives executing the vision I'd articulated from the comfort of a concrete bunker. The convoy departed at 04:30 through the emergency tunnel, emerging into a pre-dawn landscape that the drone's camera rendered in grainy green. I watched from the tactical center as 2 vehicles moved along mountain roads, navigating around abandoned cars and fallen trees with the careful precision of Dana's driving. Priya maintained continuous communication, relaying drone imagery and scanning for infected movement along the road. They reached the school at 07:12. The drone showed the building surrounded by a loose cordon of infected, perhaps 20, circling the perimeter in a pattern that resembled nothing so much as a siege. The infected had learned that the people inside would eventually have to emerge, and they were waiting with a patience that predated any human military doctrine. Dana's team approached from the north, using vehicle noise to draw the infected away from the school's rear entrance. Voss coordinated the diversion with hand signals from the lead vehicle's roof. Exposed, vulnerable, and operating with a composure that I was beginning to understand wasn't training alone, but something closer to vocation. The diversion succeeded. The infected pursued the vehicles. The school's rear door opened and Joanna Merritt appeared, a tall woman with braided hair and the sunken eyes of someone who had been responsible for too many lives with too few resources. Marcus entered first. Felix followed. They carried water. Watching from the monitor, I pressed my palm against the screen and felt nothing but cold glass and overwhelming pride. The school operation established a template. Over the following 6 weeks, Meridian's network expanded to include 4 satellite sites within a 20-mile radius. Each one a cluster of survivors who had been located through Priya's communications monitoring and supported through resource convoys coordinated from the tactical center. The elementary school became Site 2, reinforced by Felix's engineering and supplied with a mobile water purification unit from Meridian stores. A church camp in the foothills became Site 3. A decommissioned fire station became Site 4. A family farm with an intact root cellar and functioning well became Site 5. Each site was self-governing, connected to Meridian through encrypted radio, and supported with periodic supply deliveries. No site was subordinate to another. No military hierarchy was imposed. The structure was horizontal, cooperative, and fragile in exactly the ways that mattered. Because fragility demanded communication, and communication demanded trust. And trust was the one resource no engineering could manufacture. Colonel Sharp noticed. She reopened the channel after the fourth site was established and spoke with a tone I hadn't heard before. Something between professional curiosity and grudging admiration. She said our network was the most effective civilian survivor organization in her operational area. She said it contradicted every model her analysts had built for post-collapse social dynamics. She asked again for integration. I declined again. But this time, I offered something different. I proposed a mutual aid compact between Meridian's network and Sharp's military task force. Shared intelligence, coordinated response to infected swarm events, and a non-aggression guarantee. In exchange, I asked for one thing: the Colorado research data on the neurological inhibitor Sharp had mentioned during our first conversation. She agreed. The data arrived via encrypted burst transmission 3 days later, and Marcus spent 72 sleepless hours reviewing it with our medical team. What he found was preliminary but genuine. A compound that disrupted the Kessler virus's hijacking of the brain's motor cortex, potentially reducing the infected's coordination and aggression. It wasn't a cure, it was a constraint. But constraints were the foundation of every system I'd ever built. Voss chose to stay at Meridian. His liaison role had evolved into something more organic, a bridge between the military's worldview and our civilian ethos, a translator of perspectives who belonged fully to neither camp but understood both. He taught a defense course to willing residents. He played chess with Gus in the evenings. He helped Laura Chen develop a curriculum for the children that included practical survival skills alongside mathematics and literature. He was quiet about his past and attentive in the present. And the community absorbed him the way a healthy organism absorbs a foreign element that turns out to be beneficial. Iris began speaking again on the 38th day. Her first word was outside, addressed to her father in the medical bay while he was cataloging supplies. Marcus stopped what he was doing and knelt in front of her, and she asked when they could go outside. He said he didn't know. She said she wanted to see the sky. He carried her to the surface access corridor and opened the inner door. Not the blast door, just the inner door. And through the narrow window in the outer door, she could see a rectangle of Virginia sky, pale blue, streaked with cirrus clouds. She pressed her face to the glass and stayed there for 40 minutes. Marcus stood behind her with his hand on her shoulder, and neither of them spoke again. And the silence between them was the most articulate thing I'd witnessed since the world collapsed. I found Dana on sublevel 2 that evening, inspecting the hydroponic bays. The plants had exceeded Nadia's projections. Leaf lettuce, radishes, beans, herbs, a small plot of strawberries that Pearl had insisted on and that had produced its first fruit that morning. Dana was holding a strawberry, turning it in her fingers under the grow lights. Not bad for a paranoid tech millionaire and a control-obsessed engineer, she said. I said, "Is that what we are?" She bit into the strawberry and chewed thoughtfully. "We used to be. I think we might be something else now." She offered me the other half. I took it. It tasted like the future. I built Meridian because I was afraid. I won't dignify it with a nobler origin. Fear drove the plans, the permits, the concrete, the steel. The 9 years of obsessive preparation for a catastrophe I simultaneously dreaded and expected. The government called it a threat to national security. My ex-wife called it avoidance. My therapist called it anticipatory grief. They were all partially right. But here is what none of them understood, and what I didn't understand myself until I was standing in a concrete corridor at 4 in the morning, listening to the sound of 60 infected bodies pressing against a chain-link fence. Preparation is not the same as isolation. Building walls is not the same as building a fortress. The difference is the door, and the willingness to open it. Meridian survived because it opened. It found Joanna Merritt and her 31 survivors because it opened. It built a network, shared intelligence, grew strawberries, and taught children mathematics beneath artificial light because it opened. The shelter was never the point. The people inside were never the point. The point was always the connection between the inside and the outside, the willingness to remain part of a world that had every reason to fall apart. I built a shelter. Then I learned that shelter is a verb.